Decided a few weeks ago that I would spend the next few weeks talking about why Catholics leave the faith and why non-Catholics will never join the faith. Hopefully in an effort to give us some perspective about our friends and relatives who no longer practice. And as much as we preach to them sometimes, at issue are some of these things that drove them away from the faith that we might not be able to understand. And so in these next few weeks, I hope to give us a little insight into perhaps why they left. And so amidst all the topics that I've spoken about, and they're on YouTube if you want to check them out, this week I thought I would focus on two reasons why many Catholics leave the faith and non-Catholics will not join the faith. And the first of those is they essentially feel like the church has failed them. And they're angry at the church for any number of reasons. The second reason has to do with scandal. And because there's scandal in the church, they leave. So first, the main reason, the church has failed me, or I'm angry with the church, or the church has walked away from me. And this issue comes up a lot of times with the sacraments, especially with marriage. And so two people fall in love, they wish to seal their love within the sacrament in the church. And you'll have many people that do not get married in the church necessarily. So why is it necessary that we get married in the church? Because I'll tell you, when they're told they can't get married on the beach or on a mountaintop or in the woods or somewhere else, many of them say, well, I don't want to be a part of that church then. But if we think about it, if we believe in God, we know that we did not create ourselves. That we are creatures of God, and therefore God owns us, essentially. And therefore, when a couple comes into the midst of God in his temple where he said he will be, they're essentially saying, before I give myself to her and she gives herself to me, that I ask your permission. It really is the tradition, I don't know if it's the tradition anymore, but where the groom will go to the father and ask his permission for his daughter's hand in marriage, that we are asking the Father for his permission to give ourselves to another. And that's why we say the sacrament should be in a church. And so if two people enter into the sacrament and they have full knowledge of the other person, and they have every intention of being open to children and being faithful for the rest of their life, if they can give their consent, they're not pressured into it or their consent isn't somehow inhibited, then a sacrament occurs. Now, we believe that everything here exists in space and time. We can touch it and it passes through time. But outside of space and time is heaven and hell and purgatory. Those things we cannot touch, and they are timeless. That's where this bond occurs. So in the marriage bond, we see rings being exchanged, we hear vows, but outside of time and space, a bond is formed that we can't touch. We cannot touch it nor affect it. It's there. And that bond lasts until death. Because as Jesus says, there is no marriage in heaven. Marriage is a bodily thing. And when we die, our body goes in the ground, our spirit goes to heaven. So, till death do us part. So what happens if someone enters into this marriage and they're not free, or they are pressured, or they don't have full knowledge, or they don't have every intention of being faithful, or they're not open to children, all these other variables? Well, then we see rings being exchanged and we hear vows, but there is no bond. There is no sacrament. That we would say, in a sense, that the sacrament was null. It never happened. That's what annulment is in the church. So on the other end of the marriage sacrament, we talked about being married in the church. At times the marriage doesn't work out, and the two split and go separate ways, but they want to get married a second time. And so there's a formal process in the church by which we decide whether or not there was that sacrament. Now, if I, as a priest, tell you that there was no sacrament, and there was a sacrament, then I'm damned for that. Because I just told you, as an authority in the church, a lie, or I was in error, and vice versa. And so by going through the church, you're essentially saying, I want what is best for God, and I want to be right in the eyes of God. Now, people will say, well, it's too expensive, or it's all based on money, or any number of things. I have a couple right now, and they're paying $10 a month to cover this. The church does not want anyone to be unable to go through this process. So it is not Catholic divorce per se. What it is essentially discovering whether or not there was a sacrament. And that's determined by a number of factors. The other part of that then too, people have questions about, well, I'm divorced, but I'm not remarried, and I'm not seeing anyone, but I can't receive the sacraments. This is an awful thing to think, because it's not true. There are so many people who are divorced, and they're not remarried, and they're not seeing someone, and yet they feel they can't approach the sacraments. They're not in a state of sin. And if they're not in a perpetual state of sin, they're welcome to any of the sacraments that are available to the normal Catholic. And that law applies to anyone who is Catholic, not just someone who is divorced. If we are living in a perpetual state of sin, if we have chosen a lifestyle that is a perpetual state of sin, then we have put ourselves outside of the sacraments of the church. We have done that. It's not that the church has said no more. We have made a decision, a choice, and with that choice, we place ourselves outside of the sacrament of the church. And so people will say, well, the church has abandoned me. Oftentimes what happens is we have abandoned the church. I see this also at baptisms, and you wouldn't think it, because you think, well, baptism, they're just getting started. How can they already, go down the wrong road? Well, oftentimes for baptisms, we have our brothers and sisters or our cousins or our parents, and we want everybody to be included. So we're choosing godparents. Now, a godparent is an example of the faith into which you're being baptized. And so if you're being baptized into the Catholic faith, we want to find the best possible Catholic in order to be the godparent. We don't want to just find the relative who doesn't have anything to do or hasn't been included in anything else. And so at times when someone will come forward and say, I want this person to be a godparent, but they're Jewish or they're Christian of another denomination, they can be a Christian witness, but they can't be a godparent. Because you want the godparent to be someone who can lead them in the Catholic faith. The same is true. Oftentimes people will say, well, I would like my brother, sister, cousin, whomever, to be a godparent, but they're not a practicing Catholic. Well, if they're not a practicing Catholic for whatever reason, they're setting the example that you can be Catholic without practicing. Or God forbid, they're a Christian now, but they used to be a Catholic. Well, why would we have them as a godparent for the Catholic Church when we want them to be instructed in that way? And so many people will leave because of that. They'll say, see, you're too strict, or see, you're driving people away, and they will leave. We're just trying to do what we're supposed to do. This year, we used to have breakfast with Santa every year, and the Knights made a nice breakfast, and there was Santa's shop and everything else. This year we're doing breakfast in Bethlehem, because I thought it was so important to instruct children in the way of the faith, and the wonderful Christmas story that is our faith. And a woman approached me last week, and she said about this whole change, Father, you know what your problem is? Now, I could have volunteered a list to her of all the problems that I have, but I didn't. And she said, your problem is you're too religious. That's right. Thank God. And that was just on Monday. I mean, it went downhill from there pretty much. But the point is, we're trying to do what is right and good and just, and that is not going to be popular all the time. And so there will be people who will say, with regards to marriage, I don't believe my marriage was valid, but I'm not going to go through that whole process. Or I don't believe I'm in a state of sin, even though I'm living this way, so I'm still going to go to communion. I'm here to tell you that is wrong. And if someone feels that way and they go, then I fulfilled my responsibility. That's no longer on me. That's on the faithful. And so if I take it upon myself to say, I don't think I'm living in a perpetual state of sin, therefore I'm receiving the Eucharist, we have to be very careful. Because at the end of our life, we will stand naked and alone before God, And the world that has told us everything's okay, nothing is wrong, will not be there to defend us. And all the excuses and explanations we've had throughout the years, the Lord will see through them. And we will see our life flash before us in an instant, and we will know. You see, it's not about preaching the difficult laws of the church. It's not about saying, don't do this and don't do that. It's about trying to get people closer to Christ. That's what we're doing. You know, the gospel and the first reading today repeat the law that all the Jews lived by. Before they would leave their house, and at night when they would come back, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Therefore, the two great laws. Love the Lord your God with all your mind and your heart and your soul and your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, why does he have to say that? He covers everything. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. I mean, real sacrificial love. With all your mind. And so the way you think, the things you read, the things you watch, the way you engage in discussion with people. With all your soul. In other words, it's a spiritual love. It's not this false dichotomy I talked about last week. This spiritual schizophrenia, where my life is one way here, that's my lived life, and here's my spiritual life over here. And never the two shall mix. Love him with all your soul. It's a spiritual thing. And finally, my strength. That what I go out and do and say, the way I act, will reinforce this love that I have for the Lord. But sometimes that's not enough. This is why Moses repeats this phrase so many times, because the people keep screwing up. And he has to say, okay, let's try this again. Hear, O Israel, the Lord. And they weren't getting it. So what does he have to do? He has to tell them exactly what they can't do. I mean, think about it, even with us. If your doctor says to you, eat healthy. Ah, but he didn't say how to eat healthy. Or they say, drive safely. Well, at 90 miles per hour, I'm a pretty safe driver. I can drive safely. No, they have to go through and say, eat healthy. You know, low fat, low sugar, etc. Go through all these things. And that's why we have the commandments. Sometimes it comes out, don't do this, don't do that, because that's the nature of us. This kind of leads into the other realm of why people leave the church and others will be unable to join the church, and that's scandal. And there's enough public scandal, I need not say more about this weekend and the days preceding. There's always going to be scandal in the church. There's scandal in every church. And the reason is because it's made up of people. If the church wasn't made up of people who are flawed and weak, well, we wouldn't have any scandal. We probably wouldn't have any people either. So every church is going to have that. It just, sometimes the Catholic Church makes the front page because we're the moral voice in the world. And people really want to take the legs out from underneath the stool. And so in any organization, and make no mistake, the church is an institution, it is an organization, you probably know people who have fallen from grace. Whether it's in a law firm, whether it's in a school, a police station, whether it's in a factory, there are always those people who are going to fail. We're all flawed human beings. You know, I don't preach to you as one who is above you. I preach to you as one of you. That I remember in the seminary they said if you preach every weekend and you never feel like a hypocrite, you're not preaching the right stuff. So absolutely, absolutely. But we are all called to holiness, and this is where we fall. The priests absolutely called to holiness, but we're a priestly people. And so every one of us is called to a higher holiness. Gandhi, I think he said it best, he said, I would be a Christian in a moment if they but followed the teachings of Christ. And we have a lot to learn from them. So our example is seen by everyone. There is no secret light here. For anyone who's a Catholic or Christian, everyone's going to be watching us. And so we have to be careful. People leave the church, they say it's scandalous, there's sinners in the church. Well, yes, that's what we are. But we have to be careful not to lead them astray. You know, thank God the early church did not follow the example of Judas Iscariot. They would say, well, he was one of the apostles. And if the apostles can't stand together, what choice do we have? That we try. We're all working toward our sanctification. We all want to be saints. And so these people who have left the church because of scandal, are they going to leave every other formal institution because of scandal? We can't do it. And those who will leave the church because they feel like the church has failed them, perhaps we can understand their perspective a little better, but think to ourselves, the church does not fail. People fail. And sometimes the reason why we decide to walk away is not because of some principle that's wrong or dogma that we disagree with. It's because of a person not letting us do what we wanted to do in the first place, or a disagreement that we had with the way they presented it. And so in the days ahead, as we go out after the lost sheep, a good prayer for us to say every time we leave the house and return: Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind and your soul and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. I'd like to take this opportunity. At some of the masses last week, I asked that we pray as families that the Lord would stay the storm from us. We suffered last year with the flooding, and that he might keep us out of harm's way. And you know what? He did. That was a miracle. Because if you know anything about New York and New Jersey, they did not fare so well. And some people will say, well, what's all the hype? And there's a lot of hype, and it missed us, almost sounding disappointed in some way. The only proper response we should have to this is absolute gratitude. And so I'd like to pause for just a moment as we offer prayers for those in New York and New Jersey and West Virginia and all the other places where people are suffering so much. And as another storm system seems to be coming into the area, we ask that the Lord might spare them any future torment. Please kneel.